Yeah, so I've been given the job of really kind of setting the scene today. So hopefully what I'm going to say will just be kind of not going into anything in too much detail, but setting things up for the rest of our speakers. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who LifeArc are, because I'm guessing that quite a lot of you won't be familiar with who LifeArc are and why we're interested in the rare disease space and why we think we can help and what allows us to do that. I'll then move on to talking a little bit more about what translation actually is and what we mean by translation. I'll chat about things like target product profiles and tools that we can use in translation, what a research project looks like, how to review a translational project. I won't dwell on those too much because we've got some excellent expert speakers this afternoon going to be talking in more detail about that. And then I'll throw out some thoughts on how patient groups can support translational projects. And hopefully that just is kind of thoughts for helping for the discussion this afternoon. And you guys will have much more creative ideas on how you can help and how you might want to drive the kind of agenda forward. So, yeah, I'm going to start by telling you who LifeArc are and why we're interested in this space. So, LifeArc started off its existence as MRC technology. We were set up by the Medical Research Council to do their technology transfer initially. And then we were established as an independent charity, not-for-profit, in 2000. And that enabled us to continue supporting the MRC, but also diversify, taking on other clients, doing our own work in-house. So we've got our own in-house scientists who do drug discovery, and they have an annual spend of around 17 million a year. And so far, we've got 4 marketed drugs on the market. So, as I mentioned, we've got our own in-house drug discovery team. So we've got labs up in Stevenage that look, to all intents and purposes, like an industry standard set of drug discovery labs. And it's those guys that give us our sustainability strategy and bring in the money. We've also got a diagnostic team based up in Edinburgh with the state of the world labs up there. We continue to do technology transfer and continue to support the MRC and other clients in that space, including the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we provide services to the charity sector. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of my talk, because that might be of interest to some people here. But largely the charity services build on the work that we've been doing for the MRC and that expertise so that we can help charities to understand IP and translation and help to move projects along the pathway. And recently we have just developed some new funds. The most important in this space would be our Philanthropic fund that supports rare disease translational research, which is one of the reasons that we're here today to help move that space a little bit further forward. I mentioned before that we had 4 drugs on the market, and that is how we can afford to be in this space. That's why we can afford to do events like this, where we don't have to worry about making any money or any revenue return, and that's how we can fund the Philanthropic fund. So these drugs bring us in revenue, the biggest of which is Catriona, which is marketed by Merck, and that's bringing in a substantial amount of money, which gives us a lot of comfort going forward and gives us the opportunity to be more creative and make more impact without having to worry about sustainability. We do have to worry about sustainability, but my view is that that's the job of our drug discovery experts up in Stevenage, and if they can continue to make marketable, profitable drugs, then we can continue to do some real impactful, patient-focused work with the charity sector and with the Philanthropic Fund. So the strategy going forward is still to kind of continue to be sustainable, but also we've got these new funds that allow us to support work in the philanthropic space purely to benefit patients. We also have a seed fund, so that seed fund operates in the seed space, so just the start of companies, helping them to get established and develop in the very early stages. And very soon we will be launching a venture fund that will operate like a conventional venture fund. Now, the seed fund and the venture fund are looking to make a return, perhaps not quite as much as other commercial entities because we are a charity, but they are looking for more profitable things, whereas the Philanthropic Fund, we're not looking for any return at all. It can be purely philanthropic. So what is translational research? I think Rick has helpfully just kind of touched on this earlier. So I pulled out a couple of different definitions of what different people think translation is, and I suspect that if you asked 20 different people, you would get 20 slightly different answers on what exactly translation is. The European Society for Translational Medicine reckon that translation is an interdisciplinary branch of the biomedical field supported by 3 main pillars: benchside, bedside, and community. Quite like NIH's definition of translation, which is the process of turning observations in the laboratory clinic and community into interventions that improve health for individuals and the public, from diagnostics and therapeutics to medicinal products and behavioural change. I think we're going to talk mainly about therapeutics today. That's certainly where our expertise lies in therapeutic translation, but I think maybe Lou might touch on later how they support the whole spectrum of interventions that can benefit health. So how does translational research vary from basic science? So basic research really is the development of greater knowledge and understanding of fundamental aspects of biology, but without the aim of developing anything practical. It's about learning purely for the sake of learning, and improves our general knowledge, all of which gives us useful things that can then be translated. Without basic science, there would be no translation, but the way you go about doing translation is quite different to the way you go about doing basic science. You don't know what you're going to discover when you do a basic science project. Whereas hopefully, when you move into the translational space, you take a more systematic approach with a very focused objective, and all the steps that you perform in the translational space are aimed at delivering a very specific targeted product. As Rick said, it is really about going from the bench to the bedside through these different steps. Now we can, if you ask, again, 20 different people, they probably classify these in slightly different ways and put slightly different terms there. But essentially, I think translation starts right about this point of prototype design. Once you know what your product needs to look like, it's moving into the translational space. If you don't know whether you can be making a small molecule or gene therapy, then you're still probably in the basic science space. But once you know what your product needs to look like, it's moving into that translational space. And obviously, the objective is getting something that is going to make a difference to the patients at the other end. Which takes me on to talking about target product profiles. I think target product profiles are a really useful way to define exactly what it is that you need to be doing in a translational project. And I think the patient groups can have a really useful function in defining what a target product profile needs to look like. So a target product profile really is, what does the product need to look like? When you represent the patients, you know what the patients need. What do the patients need the product to look like? But it's not just about the patients. The clinicians who are going to be implementing that it needs to work for them as well. It needs to fit into the clinical path in some way. So it needs to have all the attributes of a clinically successful product. It may also need to be commercially successful. If you're going to find somebody who's going to fund the later stage of development, so you might need somebody who's got some deep pockets to take that all the way through, which might mean that they need it to be commercially successful. So you might need to incorporate that into your target product profile. But I think that target product profiles could be something that patient groups could really usefully bring the right people together to define what the product does need to look like. At the start, your target profile might be a bit of a wish list, but if you break it down into sort of three groups, you've got an aspirational profile, which is really absolutely the gold standard of what, if the world is ideal, your product would look like. But then there's also a basic profile, which is what you might be prepared to let the product away with. You might be prepared to tolerate more toxicity, depending on the disease. You might be able to tolerate a less acceptable method of intervention. So rather than having a pill, you might be prepared to take an injection. There are different compromises that may have to be made. And hopefully you get somewhere in the middle, which is a realistic, achievable product profile that probably isn't going to be quite where your aspirational one is. But it's quite helpful to define each of your different criteria on these kind of three levels so that you can kind of aim for the gold standard, even if it's not realistic to be delivered. The things that you would want to include in a target product profile, obviously you want to start with what disease you're targeting, although some therapeutics might be treating symptoms, so they might cover a number of diseases. Which patient populations are you treating? At what stage of the disease? Do you need to get them at a particular point before disease has progressed to a particular level? And that, again, could depend very much on your aspirational profile as well as your basic one. What level of clinical efficacy do you need? How much expression of something do you need in order to make a difference for the patients? What level of safety and tolerability might you be prepared to consider? And there may be a trade-off between efficacy and toxicity. So it might be something that you want, obviously, an efficacious drug that does no side effects, but that might be your aspirational target product profile rather than your basic one. Stability, how long can a product be stored? Where does it need to be stored? Will it need cold chain? What is the route of administration? So how are you going to give it to the patients? Can it be a pill? Can it be inhaled? Is it an injection? What might the patients be prepared to tolerate, which might vary depending on the disease? How frequently will you need to dose your patients? The cost is really quite important, because the only thing worse than having no drug at all is having a drug that's available but nobody can afford to buy. It can also be important if you're looking at getting commercial investment later on. There needs to be a commercial strategy for commercial investors to put their money in development of projects. So developing the right type of intervention for the right disease and getting that cost ratio just right is can be quite important. And then there's time you need to consider. So what does a translational research project look like? Now, I think every translational project is slightly different, and we need to consider each project individually. But in my kind of top line of things that we can explore in more detail later, or some of the other speakers might pick out and treat in more detail later. In this space, obviously, we're talking about rare disease projects, but we need to be clear on what the exact need is that will be treated. Having a clear target product profile can be really important for defining exactly what that will be. All projects need to be grounded in strong scientific rationale, which is where the basic science piece comes in. If we understand the disease that we're trying to treat, then we can work out how best to develop a therapeutic to treat that disease. So the basic science is really important for doing translation. It teaches us about the mechanism of the disease and how the disease progresses, and all of that understanding can be really important in terms of knowing how to translate the project. The delivery plan has to be realistic. Now, translational projects very rarely go to plan. They very rarely go exactly as you would wish them to, but you need to have a realistic route to taking your project to the patients. And quite often that will be a couple of plan Bs along the way where things haven't quite worked out, but you maybe have an alternative strategy, therefore giving everybody confidence that you can actually get this type of intervention all the way through the pathway to the patients. There needs to be a route to the patients. I've put IP down here because I think IP is quite important to consider in these projects. I think in the rare disease space, there are different needs for IP. At the very minimum, you need to have freedom to operate in order to get your product all the way through to patients. And if you need someone to invest in the latter stages of development, they're almost certainly going to need an IP position. However, in the rare disease space, it might be that you're looking at a patient population who could all be treated on trial, in which case you might not be needing to look at commercial investment later on. So there could be alternative routes for some of these interventions where you might be able to get around IP issues. But it's certainly something you need to consider when thinking about what projects can be taken forward. Because again, you don't want to have a really great idea and it hit a brick wall because somebody else owns the background IP and they're preventing you from progressing the project. Translational projects are almost all multidisciplinary. I'll talk about that in a second when I talk about the project team, but because of the nature of the science, it's very unusual to find one individual who has all of the skills that you will need to consider to deliver the translational project. So this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, and for all projects you might not need all of these expertise, but these are just things that I think you will need to think about having individuals who have these expertises involved in a project team. You need to have a really good understanding of the biology. What is the disease etiology? How does it progress? You need somebody who understands that aspect of the fundamental genetic mechanisms or how the biology behaves. You need someone who understands the patients and how the disease progresses and at which stage you need to be treating people. Now, you might find that that is one and the same person, but you might find that they are two separate people, that you actually get your clinical understanding and your biological understanding from different individuals. You'll need someone who understands the technology that you're using, whether it's small molecule drug development or it's a gene therapy or whatever it is. You'll need someone who understands how you go about making that type of a therapeutic. You may need statistical expertise. Stats can be really important in translational projects. Even in the preclinical stage, you need to be thinking about doing animal experiments that are going to be useful for developing patient trials. So having somebody who understands statistics can be really important. You may need some regulatory expertise. Again, depending on the project, that might be quite light touch, or it might be more involved depending on the type of disease and the type of intervention. It's worth noting that the likes of MHRA often do give advice for free, and if you don't ask, you don't get. So it can be worth having those conversations early on when you're trying to develop a project. I said about IP earlier. Most academics in a university will have their own technology transfer service, and they should be working with them to help develop their IP profile. But it might be something that as a charity you need to also consider how the project progresses down the line. They're unlikely to need to be involved throughout the project, but it's somebody that you might need to dip into and dip out of as the project goes on. We've got Pamela coming this afternoon to talk about project management and how to manage translational projects. Having a separate project manager can be really useful in terms of keeping projects on track, particularly if you have projects that are led by really busy academics, particularly academic clinicians who find it hard to find the time to manhandle different resources and get onto their university contracts office and these kind of people. So having a separate project manager can often be really useful. And I'm sure there are lots of other disciplines that could be, depending on the project involved. You may be developing something that needs a particular type of specialist MRI imaging, and you may need a technical expert to come in on different aspects of that. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that translational research is really multidisciplinary, and you need a lot of different skills. It tends not to be one person just doing everything. You might find that one person has multiple of these skills, but it's unusual. It'd be very unusual to find a translational project with only one PI on it, because they tend to need lots of different expertises and lots of different technical expertise. I'm just going to touch on a little bit about the route to how a translational project progresses. So by and large, basic science is done by academics in university labs. And then traditionally, you would expect that the commercial sector would start to pick up on some of the stuff coming out of the basic science and take it forward. I think largely across the translational space that's changed over the last 10 years or so. So there's more academic research is progressing right through translation. But certainly to get anything all the way through to patients, you would traditionally expect that you would need a large pharma company to do the later stage development of that project. And indeed, for many projects, you probably still do need to have a large pharma partner to get your project through. But I think the rare disease space gives us an opportunity to actually think of alternative routes where we can get things to patients through slightly different methods. The patient numbers mean that actually a lot of these projects are less attractive to the pharma industry, which might mean that we need to think about ways of getting things to patients that don't involve partnering with pharma in the late stage. And pushing academics to take research much further along the translational path. And indeed, I think that we can probably see some rare disease projects that get right the way through to patients without needing a commercial partner. In which case, there are a whole host of funders who might be prepared to fund your project. I won't talk about any of these in detail. I think Lou might touch on MRC funding. But beyond that, there are other people who fund in that space. The Wellcome Trust and NIHR have a number of schemes. Ourselves at LifeArc, we have some funding available in that space. Innovate may also fund in that space. So yeah, it's something that I'm hoping that we develop as a resource actually and pop up on our website as sort of different translational funding schemes. So watch this space on that one. I've only got one slide on reviewing translational research projects. I don't know whether Lou might touch on that in more detail later. But I thought it was worth putting in a slide to say, you know, when you do get a translational project come in, like I said, you need a multidisciplinary team. You also need to get reviewers with that expertise. It's actually, if a translational project falls down in any one of those areas that we mentioned, then it could halt the whole project. So you need to get different reviewers to review the different aspects of the proposal. I would also say don't be afraid of using industry experts. There are some really good people work in industry and they are prepared to review for nothing for the charity sector. So they can be really useful. And they're not, you know, largely if you're asking them to review for a disease that's not in their project, you know, the strategy of their company, they are prepared to do it, but they're not interested in taking your ideas off you. It's just that they are the experts who really do know how to do translation and can be really useful. So don't be afraid of using industry experts. But it is worth considering confidentiality and whether you need to put a CDA in place for anything that might be commercially sensitive. The other thing that I think it's worth thinking about with translational projects is that in my experience, they don't come in perfectly formed, and actually you need to have a couple of stages of iteration often with projects. So just because something on the table isn't perfect and it's not necessarily fundable as it is, can it be improved? Can it be worked on with the academics who are bringing it forward to see if it is ultimately deliverable, and you can get that patient benefit if you go through a couple of rounds of working on things. And consider using milestones to mitigate your risk. So you don't need to fund a whole project and consider that money lost. If it's very risky, you can put in milestones, and if the project's going nowhere, you can stop it. So consider that as a strategy. How do I think that the charities and patient organisations can help in this space? I think there's possibility of funding, if you have funding. There's also the possibility to help catalyse, collaborative funding proposals. We are always open to funding in partnership with charities. If you've got some money, we will co-fund, and I'm sure other funders may consider that too. I think the patient organisations can really define what the target product profile needs to look like. Being the patient representatives, you know what the patients need a product to look like. You know what aspects of the disease need to be targeted, and so you can really be quite powerful in clarifying what that is. And indeed, commercial entities looking to fund a project may be interested that the patient body has a buy-in into that, because they're actually developing a product that the patients will buy. Patient registries, I think that's self-explanatory. You can help to put people in the right people in the room together and really connect the right experts. Patient bodies can be quite persuasive in getting experts to come on board and help, and so I think that can be really powerful. And you can help to connect those experts with funding opportunities. And you may also be able to help coordinate projects, particularly if they're you're using different expertise that's found in different geographic locations. You may be able to kind of pool those different experts together. So I was just going to quickly end on a couple of slides on some of the services that LifeArc provide. So historically, we have supported the charity sector, and we've provided services such as portfolio review. Now that's where we just look at the projects that have been funded by the charity and provide advice on where those projects have gone, where they could go, and how they might be translated. That's something that we've been doing for a number of years, and we intend to continue to do. We can review terms and conditions. We've got a whole in-house legal team who can help support some of that stuff. We can support negotiations and speaking different languages. Often academics and industry partners don't speak the same language. Technology transfer people speak a different language. I think LifeArc, we sit between all those different groups and actually can helpfully translate the language barriers and the cultural barriers between those different organisations. So we can help with that. And we can provide advice on all sorts of translational aspects, as well as funding. And that leaves me to give you a little plug for my Philanthropic fund. We can support translational rare disease projects, but that do all the things that I have mentioned earlier. We also have a seed fund that will fund in the seed space, and I will finish just slightly over time and say thank you.